Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Season 0? Season 1? Episode 0. It's the movie, Before Ever After. Before we even talk about the movie proper, we gotta talk about some behind the scenes, because there's some behind the scenes to cover. Let's do a little bit of history. Tangled came out in 2010. Frozen came out in 2013. And we know which one's best. I think we could definitively say it's the one that had the better level in Kingdom Hearts 3. That's a whole other rabbit hole. But the thing is, before Frozen came out, they threw together a little short video movie thing, which played in front of, I don't even remember the other movie, but eventually got released on its own thing. That was Tangled Ever After, which came out in 2012. Now, here's the weird thing. Tangled came out in 2010, Tangled Ever After came out in 2012, and then this, Tangled the series, or Rapunzel's Tangled Adventure, depending on who you're asking at what point in time, came out in 2017. But timeline-wise, it goes Tangled, then Tangled the series, then Tangled Ever After. This was a very strange choice, and the more I look at it, the less sense it makes. Because the sheer fact of how Tangled Ever After is constructed naturally ensures several things about Tangled the series, which from now on I'm just going to call Tangled, had to go. Like, certain things just had to be a certain way because of this. So, yeah. This series was primarily being pushed by someone named Chris Sonnenberg. He was not the only one who did it, obviously. He's been an animator for quite some time in the Disney retinue. If you've ever seen The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or Hercules, or Atlantis, you've seen some of his works here. He's also done plenty of other things, and was one of the main producers who was really pushing, like I said, for the idea of Tangled the show. I don't know how much sway he had or how good of a job he did, but he clearly did his job well, because this show is weird. Let me start going down the list here. So this show came out in 2017, obviously. Did I not hit enter? Did I seriously not hit enter? All the things. Anyways. Now I lost my train of thought. The show came out, and the initial viewing, the movie, the thing that we're covering today, was very weird because originally it was supposed to be your standard pilot episode. For those of you not familiar with how pilot episodes work, they usually get a standard double slot. A 22 becomes a 44 becomes an 88. I should mention this show was absolutely still in the era of cable television and standard television. In fact, Disney Plus came out while this show was still coming out, sometime around season 3 or so. So, you know, that's normal, right? Like, that's a normal thing. So 22 goes to 44. This movie is 55 minutes long, which is really weird, actually. And the reason why I actually did a little digging on this, the reason why specifically, is they argued they couldn't cut down any time in the episode. There was no storyboarding that could be chopped, so they wanted to pull it down, so they wanted to push it up, to 55, rather than trying to cut something somewhere and pull it down to 44. Not sure I 100% agree, but they were able to argue that up. Now, that's important, because I feel like it's the first domino in explaining why this show was a commercial failure. Not a critical failure. I have not seen the show and I have no idea of its quality. In fact, by all accounts, it seems to be a rather popular show of everybody who's ever seen it. But in terms of financials, this show kind of bombed on the financial side of things. Now, the thing is, you're probably thinking, what is the movie having 55 minutes to have to do with anything? Well, that means the slot's weird. And because the slot's weird, it doesn't slot in neatly to any other slot. Which means when they actually threw this thing out, they kind of needed to push it into a weird position, which they did, of course. They got a nice big Friday night shot, obviously, because new shows usually get the Friday night slot. That's the primo slot for a reason. Remember, this was back when television had specific slots of when things would be released during the day, and that had a significant impact on how well a particular show did. Keep that in mind. That's going to come up. So, got the Friday night slot, had a weird positioning, didn't get all the ad revenues ratings that it probably should have, and because of a general lack of a marketing push initially, it didn't do particularly well on its launch views, which was 2.9 million. Now, 2.9 million is not bad, really. However, the number they were aiming for, the number that was the designated target, was 5 million, so it came up pretty short. It's also worth noting that there was another movie that came out pretty much at the same time, which was called The Descendants 2, sequel to The Descendants, which itself is like, it's a dumb movie. I'm not a big fan of it, but it's about like, hey, here's the kids who are the children of the Disney villains going around and having adventures, and they're like themed based off of the villains they're the children of. That one managed 5.3 million. Another thing that was happening at the time was that this show was live at the same time of Elena of Avalor. Now, most of you in chat probably have never heard of that because you probably don't have nieces to take care of. But as a consequence of the said nieces, I have actually seen a decent amount of that show. It's a surprisingly decent show, but it's still absolutely crushed Tangled in terms of viewing figures. So hang on. All I'm talking about is how much this show has failed. You're probably thinking, how did it get a movie and an unusual time slot for a movie and 3 seasons? The real answer, the ultimate answer here is, I don't know. I have done a fairly large amount of research for this show before we walked into it, and I have absolutely no idea why it is this show got the support and stylings that it did. Because here's the thing. The show was greenlit before it ever got started. Let me explain how unusual that is. In television, even nowadays with streaming, but especially back in the day, usually what happens is you get a pilot greenlit. The pilot is then thrown together, you get people hired, you get sets built, you get special effects studios working on the kind of things you want. You throw out the pilot, it's a little rough, everyone knows it's a little rough. That's understandable. Everyone accepts that this is a rough pilot. You go ahead, you look at the rough pilot, and you say, okay, this is either good enough to greenlight 1 season, or it's not, and the pilot's all that's ever made. The overwhelming majority of television in terms of shows, like if you look at every show ever made, all of it, over 60, maybe even 70% of that is shows that only ever had 1 episode made ever, and that's the pilot. So that's the norm. So once the pilot's made, if it's something that someone in the studio is either fighting for, or it tests well, or the people like the test screenings, or whatever, there's lots of processes they go through. Eventually they say, okay, we'll go ahead and greenlight 1 season. Then you get 1 season. And then at a certain point in the season, they look at exactly how well it's performing, and they say, okay, this is performing at this level, we'll go ahead and greenlight a 2nd season, and so forth and so on, right? Like, the reason TNG was 7 seasons wasn't because they planned that out in advance. It's because when they were getting through season 6, they decided to go ahead and chop it after the next one. How do you measure a show's performance? Voodoo. Okay, that's obviously a slight exaggeration, but trust me when I say that all of the viewing figures that we used to use for a show's performance is such a ridiculous amount of nonsense that it's actually kind of funny to think about in hindsight. Now, with Netflix and Disney Plus and the like, you can actually have tangible data, just like I have on YouTube. I can tell you exactly how many people look at my show. I can tell you how much of my individual episodes they watch. I can tell you how many minutes they've watched of my channel across which specific things. We have tons of data now. Back in the day, not so much. You'll forgive me for not going fully down the rabbit hole on that one, because there's actually several things that they use. Even the Nielsen ratings thing is something that itself has multiple layers to it. But it's all wild guesstimations, which is presuming that people are answering surveys correctly. And that's the simplest way to answer that. So, okay. Instead of all of the usual approach, they decided to do something for, I believe, the 2nd time ever from Disney's perspective. They just went ahead and said, you get 3 seasons. And they greenlit that immediately before the movie was even out. Someone somewhere was making deals on that, I guarantee it. Remember, there's almost always, for any show, game, or movie you've ever seen, there's some producer or producers somewhere in the offices who are constantly infighting amongst all the other producers, trying to make sure that their particular baby gets budget. And whoever the producer is, specifically for Tangled, successfully won a hell of an arm wrestle because they managed to get this thing fully greenlit and then not canceled for 3 years. Here's the thing. Some of you may or may not know this, but producers tend to be children. They're juvenile, they're stupid, and they're petty. No offense, but it's true. They tend to be extraordinarily petty, because you're probably thinking, well, hang on. Lore. I'm not your target audience for this. I've never even heard of this show. And honestly, I'm going to go and say I had never heard of this show prior to it being added to the list for the Streamations. Because the thing is, despite... No, Kitsumi, not quite literal. Despite the obvious push initially and the good slot for the movie, this show was nothing but sabotaged. And I do mean nothing. Let's look at this, shall we? So, after the first thing, the show was immediately moved from its Friday night slot to a Sunday night slot. Okay, that's not great. The Friday night slot is considered the golden slot for a reason. But any weekday night slot is considered a good slot as well. There's like a gradient of which slot was worth how much to which types of audiences. People have been studying this for 60 years at this point. Okay, it's a slight exaggeration. It's probably closer to... No, actually, 60 years is about right. But we'll say 50 years at this point. Yeah, no kidding, Ross. So... Big thing, right? So we're going from Friday nights to Sunday nights. Sunday nights is not a good slot because most of the kids are going to bed relatively early to get ready for school the next day, and most of the adults aren't going to stay up late on a Sunday night because they have work the next day. So that's not a great time slot, but it's still not terrible. It's just definitely being shoved down a bit. Then it was moved again to Saturday mornings. Okay, well, that's kind of a weird slot. The Saturday morning slot is specifically what you do if you're wanting to produce a kids show. In other words, that's where you put the cartoons. You're probably thinking, well, yeah, this is our cartoon. No. I mean, kids shows. I mean, this is where you put things for the 1 through 7 era, right? That's when the kids wake up before their parents, who are tired because they've had a 5-day work week, and the kids are like, you know, oh, let's go watch something. Yeah, exactly. The parents usually... So that probably doesn't sound like much of a sabotage, but it actually is, because so much of the intended audience for this show was in the older range, the young adult range or the adult range, the 10 to 20 or the 20 plus range. So that meant the only people watching the show were the really young kids during its Saturday night slot, which naturally hurt its viewing figures even more. Okay. Then things got even weirder, because apparently this just was not actually even more of an insult to this show, because the sabotage continues. After being shoved to Saturday morning, reruns were shoved down to early mornings at a very bad time slot. I didn't actually write down the time because I'm an idiot, but it's right when school starts, so it was like at 8 o'clock or something like that. That's a terrible time for reruns. 8 o'clock in the mornings for reruns? The kids are at school, and the adults are at work, or on their way to work. So, like, one of the worst rerun times that can exist. Then, reruns just went away completely. They actually stopped rerunning this show. It was functionally pulled from syndication when they hit season 2. You need to understand how crazy that is, by the way. Syndication, that is, there's a whole thing here. God, I'm trying not to go too far down the rabbit hole. You have to understand, reruns are the lifeblood of a show. I know that sounds weird because so much of television is usually focused on the initial launch and that initial launch window, and it is, but what keeps a show going, what makes a show popular long-term, is the reruns. The reason Star Trek was so powerful and had so much of an impact culturally was because of its syndication cycle. When those reruns started getting showed on other channels, on other broadcasting networks, and other people were able to see so much of it, and therefore actually get into the show. Reruns are actually so well valued. It's one of the biggest reasons why so many shows for so many decades have pushed against the very concept of continuity, because then they could just slot in which rerun they wanted to anywhere. Yeah, the money was always in syndication. Yeah, this is also happening during the switch from cable over to streaming. Remember, Disney Plus launched during season 3 of this very show. And Netflix was already long since a thing at this point. So there's this kind of chunk going on here. And so I'm sorry, I feel like I'm under explaining this, but they cut reruns in season 2. But then it's like, okay. We'll move the launch date again to Sunday morning, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever on any level. I don't even know what they were thinking with that one. And then they showed reruns again for like a couple of months, and then axed reruns again. Then they stopped showing the show entirely for months, and then started showing the show again. But then they stopped showing the show again. 2 giant gaps of several months in broadcasting. Not because of technical issues, they just stopped showing the show at all. It just didn't get any slot at all. It just wasn't like they've got the videotape, they've got the reel in the office ready to broadcast, and they just haven't hit go for months, twice. But then season 3 really finally gets going and finally starts going live, and season 3 had a solid time slot which it used for the rest of its run at 1 p.m. in the afternoon on weekdays. That has to be the perfect middle finger slot right there. Of all of the time slots it's had, that's the worst. New episodes going live at 1 p.m. guarantees nobody's going to watch that. Anybody who's an adult is at work, and it's too late to be during their lunch break. And anybody who's at school doesn't get off school for another hour or 2 or 3. Now, try to be shocked. The viewing figures towards the end there just went... Exactly, Ross. All of this is clear, deliberate sabotage. I mean, I don't even have to have the sheer breadth of experience I have with television productions to tell you, because every single one of you can tell, this is deliberate. People were doing this on purpose. And that's my overall point. This is my dominant theory on what the hell was going on with this show. Someone managed to get the show greenlit in advance, and someone else didn't like that. And so the revenge they got was by sabotaging, because remember, background producers are children. Hang on, I got one last little bombshell here, really quick. The show actually had pretty good ratings through its entire run. Somehow. Despite everything. And the reason I make all of that very, very clear is that if they had properly supported this show, it is 100% fundamentally clear that this show would have done really well. It's a good show. I can tell you right now, even just from looking at it. It's got very solid animation, very good voice acting work, and a lot of just general quality in its style and its presentation. And I cannot imagine in any world that this show would not have done bonkers well if they properly supported it. But no. They nuked it. A preppy stepmom? What kind of website is that? Sorry. I mean, yeah, nowadays you can just watch it on Disney Plus. And it's worth noting that I did find a few for some reason, Disney likes to really stay quiet about their viewing figures for streaming shows, which is weird since now the figures are so much more like we were talking about earlier. It's so much easier to show actual viewing figures. And now they've decided to suddenly get quiet about the actual viewing figures for some stupid reason. I don't know, people are dumb. But either way, I was able to find a little bit of info. And surely enough, this show has been doing a pretty good job on Disney+. Go figure. So yeah, the sabotage meant that a lot of particular demographics just weren't watching the show when it went live. And that directly affected one big thing. I'm sorry, Bragwin. Merchandising. We've actually already talked about this week, in fact, but I'm going to do a very, very, very brief read-through of this idea, because television shows and funding television shows is a thing. because television shows do not generate direct money the way a lot of other things do. A game generates a sale, a movie generates a ticket or a purchase, but a show doesn't really generate anything directly. It generates things indirectly in terms of ad revenue or in terms of merchandising or licensing. Merchandising. We need Tangled the Flamethrower. This has been true for decades. Remember, Spaceballs came out in the 80s, and they were already making fun of this. This is an old thing. So, the merchandising for the show didn't do well, almost assuredly because of how much it was sabotaged. I don't know what else to add to that, because once again, this is the type of thing that would have probably done substantially better if someone had actually decided to support the goddamn thing. I was looking at Chris Sonnenberg's own Twitter on this, getting some interviews and some information on this. And yeah, the fact that the show wasn't moving the merch is the specific reason that was always cited as why the show was never going to be continued past season 3, and why it is that they decided to just discontinue its particular time slots. The thing is, I'm sorry, that's actually not true. No offense to Mr. Sonnenberg, but it's the other way around. The show being sabotaged is what killed the merchandising sales, not lack of merchandising sales caused the show to be sabotaged. Which streaming site would I go out of my way to sub to without my show? None. There's nothing out there for me. Alright, so... Oh yeah, Tangled has done quite well, but it kind of depends on what metric you're using, Bionic Punk. Because while Tangled certainly did well, Frozen... let's speak very clearly. Frozen's merchandising was pretty good. Although not nearly as good as, of all things, Finding Nemo and Finding Dory. But both of those were completely, absolutely curb-stomped by the biggest merchandising juggernaut that Disney's ever seen. Can you guess what it is before I tell you, or do you already know? Because the amount of money... Yep, it's Cars. The amount of money that Cars made on merchandising is legitimately gobsmacking. Cars is a juggernaut of merchandising and has made so much more money. It's why Cars has pretty much always been guaranteed sequels every time someone's brought one up. Because, yeah, Cars has, at several points in its history, made more money in merchandising than Star Wars has. And I can start going down the rabbit hole of Star Wars as well. Remember, just last year, they shut down the Galactic Star Cruiser thing. And the merchandising on Star Wars has actually been dipping in terms of viability, which makes sense for a lot of reasons. But, regardless of all of that, I can't even think of any Tangled merchandising off the top of my head other than, like, the typical Barbie thing. And I don't mean that as a dig. I mean, I have 3 nieces. 2 of them are quite young, and all of them have plenty of toys, which are merchandise thing. And they don't have any Tangled stuff. So all of that... This just... all of that leads us to the actual film itself. So the first thing we do is we do a quick rundown of the film, the original film. Animated book aesthetic. One thing I noticed immediately is they do this, and I wish I could show you this, but thanks for that, Disney. Their animated style, first of all, it looks straight out of a coloring book, or not a coloring book, but like a storybook. But the thing that I really, really like is there's no outlines. Now, don't mistake me, I don't mind outlines, especially when they're well done or stylized. You know, the Borderlands style, as some people like to call it. Not like the Borderlands the film, that's a whole other thing. But instead, there are no outlines on the thing. So the only thing distinguishing where the person's face ends and where the sky behind him begins is the color distinction. The reason that's so important is because a lot of thought and effort is put into exactly that, color distinction. I bet you noticed it without even noticing it. The usage of color in this show is kind of crazy good. The amount of time and effort that they spend on which colors should be where and what exact colors those should be is really, really high quality because they always are thinking about it and about what should be. It affects blocking as well because you have to have some things that aren't against other things in one direction or the other because otherwise they just won't be as distinct. You literally will stop being able to see it and it'll look bad. So they use this contrast constantly, and that also means a very, very wide palette. The sheer number and types of colors that are on display is kind of crazy. I hate to keep using that word, but it's insane how much time and effort was put into making this thing look as distinct as it is. This is probably the second most impressive animated show I've ever seen. So, quick and dirty intro. A weird cold open, to say the least. It is a cold open. Let's call it what it is, because this is still in the era when that was a thing. Although, again, cold opens are still done now, even with streaming being a thing. Arcane does not count. Arcane is not animated. It is CGI. And I do not mean that as an elitist thing, but rather the CGI shows are different. They're over here. It's a whole different category. Animated, that is to say 2D animation, and CGI, that is to say 3D animation. Very, very, very different animals. I'd have to think about what the best CGI show I've ever seen is after Arcane. And yes, MLP being the first, most dominantly when we get to season 9 of MLP, which I actually reached out, this is true, when I was covering the Donkey Kong Country show, I reached out to a person and said, hey, could you do me a favor and run through this and really tell me in technical terms, what's going on here? And I ran them through a couple of shows. Those shows included some old Hanna-Barbera cartoons, which are gutter trash in terms of animation quality. Try to be shocked. I also ran them through Star Trek the Animated Series. Obviously, I showed off the Donkey Kong Country show, but it was also showing off Cyberpunk Edge Runners, the recent one, and a couple of other animes as well, including Akira was one that came up immediately, and Princess Mononoke. And then, of course, I had them look at MLP. Guess which one they, the professional animator, liked the best? But the specific reason why... I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit down the rabbit hole on something unrelated, but you got me talking about this, so here we are. The reason they said MLP was the best was because MLP writes on twos, which means it's very variable. It's generally speaking 12 or 24 frames per second. But what they were doing is... usually what specific thing was being animated on what specific frame alternated. A good example is you'd see a shot of birds who are flapping their wings. So these are animated every 2 frames, and then 2 frames, then 2 frames, then 2 frames. But A, the specific wing beats were different each specific step, and B, they were offset from each other. So this would be on frame 1 and then 3, then switch like this, whereas this one would be on frame 2 and then 4. And you get the idea immediately. Because they layered how much animation was happening, even though it is still functionally 24 frames per second, it actually looks a lot closer to 60. It looks extremely smooth because there's always something animating every single frame. It's just not always the same individual thing. And this is true even with individual models. This specific shot that I was showing this person was Fluttershy. And Fluttershy's hair was shifting separately from their eyes, which was shifting separately from their body. So even within an individual character, one specific model, there was that variance of movement, making the whole object look like it's constantly animating. So, point overall being, that's some very, very high quality stuff. Now, I didn't run them through Tangled. I'm going to actually reach out to them and try to get a hold of them and see if they can give me some time and look at Tangled, how Tangled does animation, because this looks like some good stuff on display here. It wouldn't surprise me if they're using a similar format, because MLP was animated in Flash, which allowed them to kind of shortcut a lot of what would usually be an absolute aggravation of time and effort in manually drawing out stuff. Okay, so sorry. I know we kind of went off topic there, but the point is I love the color distinction. I love the usage of movement, and I love how they do this. The cold open has a quick showcasing of Rapunzel with the shorter hair, which I'm already so used to that it was actually really weird when she grew her hair out. Spoilers. Friendlier trims with the guards, which is actually its own weird thing. Like the whole thing starts like, oh my god, we've got to escape the guards. We're just racing them. Oh, tell me about it, Bonnie Punk. We also see something which is obviously thematically significant, but also there's a bit of world building here. The thematic significance of the wall and keeping her cloistered in is so I feel silly about commenting on it. But what I found most interesting is when they get up over that wall and look over the edge of it and out at the rest of the world, we see that there's towns and villages pretty much right outside the central walls. We also know that the walls are pretty far out from the castle proper. This is an interesting construction. There's real life reasons to have this kind of an outer wall set up in terms of defenses for a kingdom, and it implies a lot of things that I'm not sure they're ever going to follow through on. I'm just going to let that sit for right now. We'll see if they ever follow through on the ideas of the I can't remember what it's called, but it's the space in between the central wall and the moat, which we do have, and then the outer wall, which protects like the immediate farmland and surrounding areas. And then of course we see a river, beautiful, beautiful shot just beyond there, the outer kingdom present, and a lot of implication. We'll skip over that for the moment. So, the woman who literally grew up in a tower is having issue being a princess, try to be shot. There's huge swaths of details here that I'm just going to brush over because a lot of it is trying to accomplish something which is kind of a risky and dangerous thing. See, it would be very, very easy for this to be, well, a kingdom, you know, like a real life kingdom. And if that was true, then her life has just become hell because she's a princess in a kingdom. Like, you remember Pentiment, right? Or if that's not sufficient, you remember Crusader Kings 3, right? Or maybe you've just actually read history. So that's terrible. But no. This isn't real life. This isn't some dystopia. This isn't hell. It's supposed to be a benevolent kingdom. Remember, kings are good and emperors are bad and all that. So they don't swing too far that way. But they can't go too far the other way because they need to show that as a princess, she has a job, she has responsibilities, she has duties, she has things that she has to keep up with and deal with. Ironically, the same point applies in both directions. If this is a benevolent kingdom, then as a governmental official, she has a lot of work to do. So they kind of lean into that. Yeah, exactly, Bionic Punk. Could you imagine? She is allowed to be willing to say yes to a marriage proposal from a guy of no standing and no noble birth. The mere fact, I know that's such a duh saying, but the mere fact that that's true says all it needs to about the nature of the politics on display here. Yeah, and of course Clancy Brown, who I recognized immediately, by the way. In fact, I didn't even realize it was a thing at first. I'm sorry, I cannot not recognize Clancy Brown. He's in so many things. He's in Star Trek, he's in Fallout, he's in Tangled now, he's in frickin' Detroit Become Human. Come on, how can I not recognize Clancy Brown? Anyways, so she's feeling cloistered. She's feeling pressured. He's also in the Star Wars. We also have this wonderful little bit about a Lady Kane, who, of course, naturally lives in the sewers. Okay. Yeah, no kidding, Act. I was too. Who's Mr. Krabs? So, I do like how supportive Eugene is overall. It's nice to see someone... This is going to sound weird. It's nice to see someone who's definitively male without that being a bad thing. If you happen to know anything about how fiction tends to portray a typical male, you probably know why I say that. He manages a fine line, and they do some good stuff with him. He is supportive, he is considerate, he's caring, but he also has absolutely no problem being a guy and actually having his own wants and needs and screwing up occasionally, but also being able to recover from that. And, of course, this whole movie, he's constantly trying to go ahead and pop the question, which of course doesn't. We'll come to that in just a second. So we have a fairly typical, you don't fit in theme. I'll come back to that in just a second. I do love her literally bear hugging the first day, just going forward and straight up glomping her. That got an actual laugh out of me. The rest of it was just whatever, but well, of course she fumbles at this. Nobility, even in fiction, likes to make up rules when it comes to social interactions as a way to distinguish them from other tiers of social interaction, to showcase that they are a part of this particular echelon. So they have their own rules and their own games that they play. Like, they even say this flat out. This fake hair, and I quote, designates high social status. Like, that's the kind of stuff that they'll just sort of do, and was a real thing in real life. So that, yeah, no, exactly. It's a form of admission fee. If you can't afford to be able to have this type of thing done by this type of person in this type of way, and if you've fallen behind on the current trends, why are you even here? It is more or less literally the ticket at the door for some of this stuff. And yeah, meanwhile, Eugene is over there. Yeah, we'll come back to Eugene. So Rapunzel, right? Obviously, this is a lot of her not fitting in, and a lot of her having responsibilities, and a lot of her being crushed in. And you've seen this story before, because you've seen any Disney princess story ever. That's not a dig. I like how seamlessly it slides into that familiar slot, right? This goes all the way back to Ariel in The Little Mermaid. They have responsibilities, but they're disillusioned with their royal life. It has a good job to connecting. Like you'd think this would be the kind of thing that would push kids away because, oh my God, I'm this rich, spoiled snob. Woe is me in my terrible life. And yet what they usually do in the good films, in the good Disney princess stories, is they try to, even though they're using the framework of being wealthy and privileged, they frame it in a way so that we see it from the perspective of the princess herself, and we see how she's being stifled by her parents, by her position, by her kingdom, by her life. And that is the kind of thing that can actually connect pretty well with children, because a lot of children feel stifled by their parents, even if they actually have good parents. That's normal, that's development. Then as I was typing this note up, this is when the scene showed with her being escorted around town by a bunch of guards who were so hilariously over the top. It's actually probably the worst sequence in the movie, to be quite honest with you. Like, holy crap. The guards flat out refusing to let her interact with anybody. Refusing to let her eat the cupcake. Refusing to just... Wow! You ever dealt with a helicopter parent before? Because this is what it looks like if your helicopter parent happens to have a brigade of guards at his disposal. Eugene even makes a crack about it, or maybe it was Cassandra, I actually forget which. Maybe one of them says, hey, maybe your dad will get someone to chew your food for you. It does make sense. They never say it outright, but it does make sense that the father is way overprotective in this situation. There's one scene which references that, where he's staring at the open door, window? I can't remember what the term is. It's the thing that you open to go out into your balcony. And he's staring at it, and he hears the sound of, his baby being kidnapped. And he rushes up and slams the door shut and just kind of grips it there. And you could see how much he's struggling with that. I understand that completely. But that doesn't make what he's doing right. It just makes it understandable. Yeah, the Queen is also universally supportive. Again, that's pretty normal in these kind of things. Although it is surprising she actually has a mother. Usually the Disney princess only has one parent. King Triton, hello. So this leads to the proposal. It's a sweet proposal. In public, in front of everybody. And she says no. Or more accurately, she says, give me some time. But let's be honest, what she did was, that's a no. And Eugene is just... But he actually takes it surprisingly well. But it's pretty obvious that was absolutely crushing. Yeah, why did he propose in front of everyone? That's actually an interesting question. I could go down the rabbit hole. There's a lot of rabbit holes around here. Of exactly what goes into a proposal and how a good proposal can and should work. But what it really boils down to, and this is the golden rule when it comes to proposals, know her answer before you ask. You could switch the genders. The gender doesn't matter. Know the answer before you ask. That's what you need to do there, because otherwise you're setting yourself up for all kinds of problems. Yeah, exactly, Bonapunk. Once the actual formal proposal is kind of making it official, but you've probably had this chat before if you're actually a couple and you're actually getting together. So that leads to a moment. This is when we finally get the name Cassandra. First time I've actually seen that name. I was paying attention to whoever this raven-haired woman was. She's obviously the villain. I actually thought she was Lady Kane at first. So we see Cassandra, who is apparently the lady in waiting, and is also apparently the daughter of the Royal Guard, or the Royal Captain, excuse me. Captain of the Guard. We have shenanigans. Eugene, like we have to have our shenanigan quota. I have nothing to say about the shenanigans quota. The shenanigans, trying to cover for her because she's escaped. And TSB shows up. Hello, TSB. Happy Friday. We have our first montage. The first thing we see, and I cannot assume this is on accident, the first thing we see as soon as they get outside the castle walls is infrastructure that's falling apart. Again, they never do anything with this in the film, but it does make me wonder about the state of the kingdom outside the walls. Just food for thought. It could also be a purely thematic kind of a thing. You know, once you're no longer protected, now you're in unsafe territory, and I mean, that bridge was not safe for walking. I do like that they made a point of actually having the horses stay behind, because duh. And yeah, it was obviously there to set up for the action scene in a minute. And then we see the spot where the flower had grown. Yeah, I caught that. And apparently the spot where the flower had grown that gave her hair originally is growing these really strong, functionally indestructible, blackish, like light bluish spikes. They don't look metal, but they sure act like they are. And she touches it, and her hair grows back. Yay. Yeah, some Tiberium. That's a good word. I'll start calling that Tiberium, because, And we've already been slowly shifting from fairy tale to fantasy, kind of shifting into the D&D vibes a little bit. Obsidian. That's a good point. It does look very obsidian. It looks evil, as it should. We don't actually explain what these are, and nor should we. I'm sure there's some kind of contiguousness to the show, and I did see one thing in the behind the scenes that I haven't talked about yet. But either way, it makes sense that they're trying to just kind of leave breadcrumbs, laying bricks, essentially, to try and set up for future story arcs. Because again, this is just a pilot. So, big action, escape sequence. Max continues to be fantastic. I have nothing else to add to that. Max is great. But the nature of her hair and how her hair has now taken on the properties of the spikes, and therefore she now has this indestructible weapon at her disposal that is functionally magic. Like, it's at this point she has a superpower, right? Once per short rest, you have the ability to use your hair and animate it as a weapon. It can operate as a whip. It can operate as a swing. You get it. I love how, once again, Eugene is very supportive here. There's a bit where he finds out, you know, he's like, oh my god, are you okay? And he sees the hair is back. And he has this whole speech, which I thought about writing down. I've been thinking about it, Bregman. You know, we've got some suspension of disbelief. I'm not really complaining about that. It's a superpower. It's an ability you can use once per day. I get it. You can turn into a giant demon and eat angels. Wait, what? So, I like how supportive Eugene is here again. He has a whole speech which he runs through very, very quickly. But the part I wrote down, it is, obviously you don't want to tell me, otherwise you would have already. It's a nice balancing point between, I desperately want to know, but I'm trying not to push you because if you wanted to tell me, you already would have. That kind of self-awareness works. One of the values, I'm sure Savacom would agree with this if she was here, one of the values in having a character already be in a pre-existing relationship when you've already started a work is that you can do stuff like this, that they already have a sufficient attachment and connection to each other, that you can have these kind of back and forth things where they understand each other well enough to just kind of skip over what would usually be a drama point, which is what they do here. So they go to try and have a montage, and there's this wonderful bit. Where we have a montage of the criminals doing really obvious robberies to obviously get caught. Now, it's really obvious to anybody paying attention that this is all being done deliberately, but I love how it's happening during the speech the king is giving to his daughter about how the world is an evil and dangerous place, and you need to be prepared for it, blah, blah, blah. I will also say the king, while I am not on his side, to be very clear, is nevertheless, it's nice to see someone more reasonable than King Triton, who is one of the worst dads in fiction, and that's impressive when you think about it. Oh no, this kingdom is super insecure. We even get a tidbit of that later. So, she uses the fake hair bonnet to hide her hair. That's actually pretty smart, I'll give you that. Oh, we don't even talk about Zeus. Let's just leave Zeus over there. And then we see a French phrase, plaisir en vous, which I am pronouncing wrong, because I wrote down a pronunciation guide and I tried several times, but I can't do French. You're going to have to work with me. But the reason I mention that, And the only reason I mentioned that, other than the obvious theme of what it actually means, which is there's more in you, is as I was setting up for all of the stuff for this show, I had to look up all of the episode names. Obviously, they're right there on the spreadsheet. The name of the very last episode is Plus Est en Vus. Moving on. So she gets in her full getup, and oh my god, she looks so awful. She looks terrible. She can barely walk. Of course, this is when we get the big reveal that the evil aristocrat lady was, dramatic pause, Lady Kane. Oh, sorry. Dun, dun, dun. Honestly, called that. She was the only one of the aristocrats who actually really got any names or presentation other than a simple, you suck, and then move on. So, yeah, it was probably her to begin with because they went out of the way to reveal who Lady Kane was earlier. We also get a little bit of Miss Kane's motive rant, tying things into the overall theme of helicopter parenting. Because the king was so upset about the kidnapping that he decided to lock up every single thief and criminal in the entire city. Yeah. That says so much. I don't even feel the need to go further into detail because that just sort of explains all that it needs to. Obviously didn't make anything better, didn't help get his daughter back, didn't make his kingdom more secure, and generally just made life worse for everyone, including her. And now we also have a little bit of a cycle of violence vibe going on here. And I'm not going to be surprised if, like, later on in the show we find out that Mother Gothel had, like, a brother or something like that. And that person's, like, back for revenge because of what happened to her, and blah, 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 you get it. And they'll probably try to pull that in several directions. So, I do like how while the the bandits are showing up and actually doing their thing, you immediately notice how Cassandra and Eugene are the only two who are noticeably on top of things. They actually recognize what's happening and start getting ready to deal with it as quickly as they can. And for some reason, and this is kind of a weirdness, but again, we've already discussed this, it's her superpower. When she reveals the hair is her big moment of, and it's like, yeah, okay. I get it. Because I'm sorry to keep re-emphasizing this, but this is her shtick. This is her kit, put into very, very simple terms. So now that she has access to her kit, the three of them, Cassandra, Eugene, and Rapunzel, do a pretty good job. And I want to give some credit to this action sequence. First of all, the frying pan is awesome. But second of all, I like how all three of them kind of get an equal amount of bad guys to knock out and defeat. In other words, each of them... It was very shampoo commercial. Each of them has, the flying pan. Each of them has an equal say in the fight. What's too common when it comes to fiction is one person will have, like, the big fight, and they'll show how badass they are. And the others will get, like, a background showing or a much briefer fight. Or maybe they'll do something very slapsticky, and that just kind of wins. And the usual reason that happens is because it's expensive doing these kind of action sequences. So they spend all the time and money on the one action sequence, and the others get a little bit. But in this case, they actually spread it out. Makes a little bit of sense since this is animated, so it doesn't really... it doesn't really matter who's getting the action sequence. Still, they did some good stuff with this. And then there's this... Yeah, Eugene is a rogue, not a fighter. Cassandra, she's a fighter. And I'm not sure what Rapunzel is yet. Because she's got her hair. And if anything, she reminds me of David from back in Cyberpunk Edgerunners. In other words, a low-level nobody who happens to have a nice bit of kit. Anyway, we'll see where they go with that as the show progresses. There's this wonderful bit where Miss Kane is like, yeah, I promise you, I'll be back. And then Max shows up with all of the actually competent guards, and that's the end of that. So the episode wraps up with a weird scene. There's a good transition to her talking to her father. Yes, Mr. Red. And he has a line that threw me. This is the last we will speak of magic of any kind to anyone. Why? Now, I don't know if they're going to follow through on that, if this is a hook that they're leaving there. But of all of the things he mandates, like you have to stay in the castle, I'm trying to protect you, the world's dangerous, I care about you, responsibilities of prison, all the things they've been doing, the fact that he clamps down on magic, we've already established in this very movie that there is magic in this setting. I mean, even the actual film, did a decent job of establishing that kind of thing. So, what? This is a weird decision on his part, and like I said, it's either indicative or weird. And that's pretty much where the film ends, because then we have a song, and the wind goes in the hair. I don't remember what that feels like. Cut to credits. Did I like the songs? They were all right. They were decent. I admittedly have been running around like a chicken with my head cut off all morning. So the reason I paused so hard there was I had to take a mental moment to push them back into my mind so I could remember them. Because I was kind of just skimming over the songs a little bit, to be honest with you. Like I was typing up notes while songs were playing. But they were fine. Like, they were good. I admit I'm leaning towards yellow myself. There is some good stuff on display here. It is well executed. It is a well-executed typical Disney princess starter. We do have some things that actually, I'm going to say this weirdly, push it up to yellow. Push it up to that good territory. We've got Eugene, who is surprisingly supportive and well-structured. We've got some little tidbits and hints that may or may not ever be followed through on. And we've got the transition into magic being a more regular aspect of the show, which I'm with. I didn't really have much of an opinion on Cassandra. I'm guessing she's a new character, and I'm guessing she's going to be a regular. But otherwise, I have no real vibe on her at the moment. Miss Kane was a villain. The animation and art style are definitely good. As I already mentioned, I am rather a fan of both. Who, Ross? So, I think that's actually all I've got there. It is a good pilot, but it is still a pilot, and it's still doing what it's doing in order to accomplish what it is. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, well, that's why it performed badly. No, we've already discussed why this show performed badly at launch. This is the kind of thing that actually probably should have performed a fairly decent hook, all things considered, and instead, well, here we are. Where is my thing? So the next, I gotta actually pull this up separate. By the way, I'm not saying this is still some executive being a dick, but I have to point out that if you pull up Tangled on Disney Plus, and I'm staring at it right now, there's Tangled the movie, and then there's Tangled Shortcuts, then there's the Tangled Before Ever After, which is this, then there's Rapunzel's Tangled Adventure, which is actually what we're going to be doing. Why are these separate? The front end on Disney Plus has never been good, and I've complained about it several times. But the way that they block these out makes no sense. The very fact that they don't have a concept such as a playlist idea, something so basic it's been around for like a decade and a half over on YouTube, is very strange to me, because these are all part of one story. And yet, unless you know that and know the order of that story yourself manually, you're just going to bounce between these having no idea how this should work. Yeah, there should be a thing where it's like, here's Tangled, and here's the Tangled story arc, if you want to be fancy about it. Or here's the Tangled playlist, or here's the Tangled universe, if you want to use that stupid word. And then it would be, in order, the movie, and then this movie we just watched, and then the show, and then the shortcuts, and then I think the shortcuts is actually before the show, sorry, but whatever, you get the idea, and actually do it in the proper timeline. The fact that they split this up is just not helping anything. By contrast, and I already kind of referenced this, Mandalorian Season 2 was very overt about go watch Boba Fett And then Boba Fett, I'm just going to spoil this for you, flat out says this will lead into Mandalorian Season 3. There's a thing there about that that's like, hey, but this is just figure it out for yourself. And I bet when I was very, very, very first lining this up and building that spreadsheet that some of you were looking at right there, one of the biggest problems I ran into immediately was figuring out the order of things, because there's just not a lot of support for this show for some stupid reason. Anyways, obviously it's not super late, so we're going to go ahead. I am going to go swap the laundry. But other than that, we're going to go ahead and start off with Season 1, Episode 1, What the Hare.